welcome to this Epic Events episode. My name is Yunus and I'm the CEO here at vFairs. I'm very excited about today's episode as we talk about the do's and don'ts of hybrid, virtual, and in-person events. I'm thrilled to be joined by Miguel Neves, our guest speaker for this episode. Miguel is editor-in-chief at Skift Meetings, formerly known as Event MB. Miguel helps event professionals develop online events and content that deliver tangible results. Miguel, welcome and thank you for joining this conversation today. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do at Skift Meetings.
Sure. Thank you, Jonas. And apologies for being off camera there. Super excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I joined Skift Meetings, used to be Event MB, just a year and a half ago. I don't know who's familiar with it, but it was founded by Julius Solaris in 2008, roughly. And it's been a really important publication for event tech, for the event industry. And it's grown from a sort of personal blog to a big company. In 2019, Skift bought the company, and it's now been rebranded to Skift Meetings. We are embracing the future of business events. That's where we're kind of focused on. And we'd like to think that we're a little bit different from other publications in the industry. We take our reporting and editorial very serious. So I'm very proud to be leading that team doing that. Personally, I'm from Portugal. There's Patrick Sardinha. He's one of my colleagues from Portugal. He's also attending. I grew up in Portugal, lived in England for a while. That's where I really kind of grew up in the event industry. I now live in Denmark with a young family with 2 kids. And kind of trying to figure out this crazy remote distributed world that we live in right now, and technology is helping a lot of that. So excited to jump in and have a talk about events, virtual, hybrid, and in person.
Thank you, Miguel, for sharing. Let's get right to it. Let me go ahead and share my screen and go over the agenda. Again, in today's episode, we will be discussing the do's and don'ts of hybrid events, virtual events, and in-person events. And again, we want both Miguel and I want this session to be as engaging as possible. So please feel free to again type in your questions in the chat area as we are going through through the session together. So let's start with hybrid events. Again, planning for hybrid events in 2022 and beyond will never be the same as planning them in 2019. Hybrid events have gained a lot of popularity post-pandemic, and for us here at vFairs, we have been conducting hybrid events, even when it was not even called hybrid events. So Miguel, I want to ask you a few questions about hybrid events and hear what you have to say. What is your take on hybrid events, both pre-pandemic and fast forward to now?
Sure. Happy to jump in. Before I jump in, do you mind if I ask it to the audience as well? I'd love to get an idea in the chat, like, how do you feel about hybrid events? Is it a yay or a nay or somewhere in between? Just add, your feelings in the chat. So I first sort of got involved in hybrid events about 10 years ago. And that was kind of when we first had smartphones, and it was Google Hangouts. And there was an event called Event Camp, and I was part of one called Event Camp Europe. And that was my first kind of taste of hybrid events. And we had about 50 people in London. We had about 10 people in a remote hub in Poland, and then a few people in Sweden, and there was people online. And at the time, it was super exciting. It was a lot of tech geeks kind of going, wow, this is cool. We can now do this crazy stuff. It was a very low budget kind of small event, but it made a big impact, and it kind of made people realize what was possible. Over the years, kind of pre-pandemic, I was part of a few other events, but it felt like it lost a little bit of energy. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit, I think the word hybrid is a little bit loaded. And that's why I also want to get the audience view, because I think hybrids, if you mean hybrid as kind of simultaneous with an online and offline audience, and you try to connect the audiences and everybody's kind of participating with each other, it is quite complex. Sometimes it can work really well, and for certain situations it can work really well, but it is complex, and you have to sort of embrace that and acknowledge that and kind of make the most of it. But also, many associations, for example, will do live streams of their main sessions. And in some ways that's hybrid too. Like, I don't like to kind of say like, that's not really hybrid. It's like, well, hybrid is whatever you want to do with it. I think as long as there's a way to participate from home or remotely and a way to participate on site, then anything goes for me. And also I think there's the idea of asynchronous hybrid as well, right? If you can watch something on demand, like you might be watching this as a recording on demand later. Hopefully what we talk about still provides you value, and you can say you still participated in this event. So in a way that's kind of hybrid as well. So I think hybrid's exciting. I think during the pandemic, it was all virtual, and now we're sort of thinking in person. Let's mix it up. We can do hybrid. I think we're going through this sort of like crash course in hybrid, and I see a few comments in the chat. We could probably address those, but I think we're going through a bit of a crash course. I think some people are figuring out what works for their organization, which I think is the right approach. I think some people are getting really scared and going, "Uh-oh, this is going to be really complex. How do I do this?" To be honest, I think we're moving slightly away, at least from the word hybrid. I don't think the word hybrid is necessarily something that attracts people. I think what attracts people is, hey, there's an in-person experience, and if I'm, able, if I don't have any accessibility issues, if I want to be there and it brings value, then I'll go. And if I can participate online, then that's also an option. And I think we know that it's different. It's a different experience. I don't think it's interchangeable. Like strictly speaking, it's not like you can just swap them out exactly. I think maybe we'll get there, or we'll get to some version of that. But at the moment, it's still a little confusing, and I think it's really interesting to see how different people are working through this idea of hybrid events.
And Miguel, I'll just add on to some of the things that you have mentioned, right? Say, again, before founding vFairs, I was an event organizer myself for almost 8 years and ran close to 100 plus events. And even at that time, from 2008 till 2016, those 8 years, I myself have done 100 plus virtual events, but at least a dozen hybrid events. And again, just the definition of hybrid events, I think, as you mentioned, sometimes can be just overloaded, because it's not about providing exactly the same experience to both audiences. It's really about what works best for the in-person, what works best for the online, and it does not have to be always at the same time. So again, as we mentioned, this conversation today, there might be 3-4 dozen people watching it right now, but this conversation will actually benefit 1,000 plus other conversation, and eventually they all will hear it on demand. And that's in a way also hybrid, right? There's some sort of virtual piece right now, and then there's some sort of a on-demand right now. And again, I think just as you mentioned, going back to what works best for the audience, just today itself, I think there is this pharmacy company, one of the biggest pharmacies in North America, who is doing a hybrid event today at this point with us. They have around 1,000 plus people in person, but then they have almost 16,000 people not watching exactly the same sessions, but a portion of that also virtually. It's just that works best for them. It's a global company. They cannot have everyone there in person in that location. So again, it's exciting, but it's different for everyone.
Yeah, and in terms of sustainability, you're saving a lot of carbon emissions there if you're able to do it remotely, and if it makes more sense for those people, it makes total sense. And I think particularly for content, for sessions from a big stage, I think we've made virtual work very well for that. I think there's other things that are a bit more different. They're a bit sort of like separate experiences. I think the content experience is quite comparable, and I like to think that if you're watching it remotely, you have a front seat, which is quite different if you're there in the middle of those 1,000 people, right? So I think in some ways, if you're really interested in the content, virtual can often be better.
Absolutely, yeah. It's like, I think, it's like watching any game. Being there in person is exciting, but at the same time, you can equally benefit from that game if you're watching it from the comfort of your home on a TV. It's not that you miss out on any key component of what has happened. It's just a different feeling, at that point.
It's like live sports, right? You go to a live sports game, it's not to watch the game better. You watch it way better on your couch with instant replays and multiple camera angles and things. It's to have a different experience. And I think it's acknowledging that, and kind of also the organizers acknowledging that, and the participants acknowledging that. I think we're still kind of struggling. We're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think, and do you think that it sometimes is better for a certain type of event versus another? So I think we mentioned, like, for a conference with a lot of sessions, I believe that virtual is equally beneficial as being there in person. Are there any kind of use cases where one audience has just a lot more benefit than the other, or the opposite?
Yeah, for sure. I think that the classic example is conferences versus trade shows. If you look at conferences, particularly with lots of different, like 30 parallel sessions, like you're there in person and you're kind of like thinking, I can't multiply myself by 30, right? But if you're watching it virtually and on demand, you can kind of pick out the things and you can fast forward and you can jump in and kind of catch that content. So I think the content side really there's a lot of advantages. But on the flip side, you can't, or it's rare when you can kind of approach the speaker after the event, like you can do live, right? And I think particular trade shows where it's all about business and meeting face to face and creating a connection, creating a relationship. I don't think that is easy to do online. It's not impossible. I think it works in some settings and with some prompting, etc. But in general, I think that relationship building kind of activity is really like the way we do it is very much a social thing. So it's hard to replicate that online. And I think it's just something we need to embrace. And if we want to do it online, we can find creative ways of doing it. But it's not, we can't assume that everybody's just going to, show up, turn on their camera, want to meet everybody in kind of breakout rooms and things like that. I think at the start of the pandemic, we sort of were more open to that. I think now a lot of people show up to virtual events or participate in hybrids remotely and turn off their camera and sort of, they're sort of getting on with their day. And I think the more we sort of go, well, that's okay. You do you, and and we'll provide you with content and we'll provide you with value. I think people appreciate that.
Perfect. Thanks, Miguel. Let's move on to the virtual events. See, again, virtual events, just again, this is how vFairs was founded. It was, I keep telling this to everyone that we interact with, whether it's VCs or whether it's anyone else, right? So, virtual events were even growing 50% to 100% year on year, even before pandemic. We as a company we're growing really fast, even before pandemic. Of course, pandemic gave us that hockey stick growth that none of us expected. But what's your take on virtual events? And again, do you feel that virtual events are going to kind of keep on growing from this point onward as well?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think they will keep on growing, but I think we need to, when we talk about sort of the virtual event market, we need to almost kind of delete the pandemic because it is that bubble, right? It is that crazy bubble that suddenly exploded. And I think it's great in terms of features and in terms of exploring what's possible. It really advanced software. I would say something like 10 times as fast as it would have done without it. You probably have more of a kind of insight into that than I do. But we need to sort of go back to where we were and not make any assumptions that sort of crazy bubble will continue. I think if we go back to where we were before the pandemic and see how we've evolved, how much better we are at producing them, how much better the software is, I think there's growth there. But it's contained, and it is about finding things that work. Like I'd love to get some kind of feelings from the audience as well, because my personal feeling is that there's not a huge difference between a webinar and a virtual event. I think some people get very offended when I say things like that, and it's like, no, our tool does like 300 more things and it's a completely different thing. And I don't disagree. But I think in essence, when you're doing kind of video events, when you're doing video communication, if you do it well, it doesn't matter if it's called a webinar or it doesn't matter if it's called a virtual event. Yes, an event sort of implies that maybe there's more sessions and it's a bit more advanced and there's more thinking. Fair enough, right? But I think at essence, we got really good at doing webinars / virtual events. The software got really good at doing great video, at bringing things in, bringing interactions, polls, etc. We just need to really exploit that as much as possible and not get stuck on like, oh, it's going to replace in person or it's doing this or that. It's like, no, let's actually just do a really good virtual event, and the audience won't be the bubble audience that was here during the pandemic, but there's still an audience out there. And I think, like you say, I think there is growth. So I'm bullish, maybe not sort of pandemic bullish, but I think there's definitely a market there.
And yeah, I think Miguel, just to give you some stats as well. Of course, I think even in our conversations with our customers, we pretty much, like you said, delete the pandemic part. But I think just to kind of give you some other numbers, we have seen on a use case by use case where pandemic, even after pandemic, that use case continues to have a lot more virtual events. And I think where there's a bit of a difference between a webinar and a virtual event is that when you want some transaction to happen during that particular event itself. So I'll give you an example of like a few of them. So you have job fairs and career fairs where it's not just purely about having a conversation with someone. It's really about having them point out to the right job, let them apply, have them interviewed, take notes, and go on. We also have one other example of a trade show, one of the most biggest company out there, kind of generate millions of dollars where they're showing products and they're getting orders worth millions of dollars, right? So for a conference, again, if it is of a certain amount of sessions, we feel that, a webinar and event can be pretty much the same. I think, and anytime you want to just have a little bit extra on top of a webinar, again, just our customers feel that that webinar itself can be a bit of a limiting factor of what they can achieve with that huge audience that they attract for that particular conference or a trade show or a job fair or an open day.
For sure. And I think one element that I think is very exciting for me is this idea of remote workforces. It's looking at the moment like a lot of companies will allow remote workforces. And so virtual events, virtual communication is so much more important than it was when everybody was at the office. And I think there's going to be a lot of growth there and a lot of kind of internal communications, even in associations and people like that, that I don't think we saw pre-pandemic. So I'm really excited about that side and sort of, the need to build a company culture. Well, you need to have communication, you need to have events, you need to get people out of their day-to-day grind, and events and virtual events are a great way to do that. You can't get the team together every week, or else you might as well be at the office, right?
Yeah. Again, so guys, everyone, Miguel and I really don't kind of script it. But Miguel, just for you to know, that use case of having a virtual office and managing a virtual remote team is one of the biggest use cases that we have been requested for, and that's something that even vFairs is about to launch, just end of Q3, based on exactly said, just pure demand of remote force. Just moving on to my
Sounds
next
good.
question.
You heard it here first, right? The roadmap is coming to life.
Yeah. So, Miguel, what attracts you to a virtual event? And again, keep it maybe high level. It can be a conference, trade show. So we know that a lot of things attract us to attend an in-person event. It can be traveling to a different city or a country or food or people. But what would attract you as just as an audience to be a part of virtual event? Is it the content? Is it the speaker? Is it the networking? Like, what do you look for as just as an attendee?
I think it's probably two things, and there's probably two things. One is the speaker. I think if it's someone who I've not heard before, or someone who I think because of their job title or the company they work at or whatever, I feel like, okay, they're going to say something interesting. This is going to be worth being part of, especially if there's Q&A and there's a way to interact. And I think that attracts me. The other side of it that attracts me is more if there's sort of different formats. If you're doing like a whiteboard collaboration on topic X, that's something that I think, hey, that's kind of different. Like how do we do that? How do we, and I think it's kind of like the breakout session in a conference. But what I mean by that is really like the hands-on breakout session, not this speaker isn't on the main stage, but they're going to have a smaller stage and you're still going to just sit and listen. But like, let's go into this room and work together on something. That really attracts me. I don't see a lot of those, but I think there's a really kind of underexploited element of, like crowdsourcing and being very community focused and saying, hey, let's all come together and kind of work around this topic or jam up this idea. And yeah, that kind of thing really attracts me.
Perfect. And just purely from a networking perspective, again, some of the things that at least we, again, a lot of what we build here at vFairs comes out of purely client requests. So again, integration with something like a Miro board or collaboration has been one of the popular features that has been requested. Again, with this remote workforce, we have just also seen that things like games online, whether spin the wheel or whether it is the ability to have a leaderboard or scavenger hunt, and then nowadays getting into this speed dating kind of a conversation, something like a Twine, and this quick 3 to 5 minutes snap conversations, and now even further with this metaverse concept, this spatial networking where you can actually see people around you around a circle and have a conversation. See, all of these features have been built by vFairs primarily based on customers' request. I just want to understand a bit of your take on some of those. Do you think some of those features is something that you as an attendee or your audience that you interact with appreciate or value any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and we could spend a lot of time on this. So I think throughout the pandemic, one thing that really developed a lot was sort of the quality of the video and the quality of overlays. And I think for a very low budget and relatively simple skills, you can now create a very professional looking kind of main stage presentation that is TV like, right? And I think a lot of platforms kind of really focus on that. A lot of teams working virtual events really focus on that. Where I think we still need to evolve a bit is other areas. I'll get to the metaverse in a bit, but I think one of the areas that I think is really interesting is that spatial kind of element that you also mentioned. I know that some platforms have ways of bringing participants onto the screen, not like in a video call, but so you see how many participants are there and where they are, and then you can like move around, for example, a little bit like a computer game.
Yeah.
I like those approaches. They're not perfect, some of them work better than others, but I really like it because one of the things I really miss with virtual events is that sense of presence, sense of walking into a room with 100, 1,000, whatever many people. And that can also be overwhelming. So that can be negative as well. But I think one thing I don't like is if I'm on a virtual event and there's like 10,000 people there, and the only way you can kind of sense that is because the chat's exploding or something like that. Like it's nice to see the chat exploding, but then it can also be overwhelming, right? Like you can't really understand what's going on. So any kind of tool that helps us understand like who's in the room and what that feels like and how that kind of adds context to the event, I think that's really interesting to explore. I want to go back to the mural board you mentioned, or the mural board. I just did a event designer course using Mural, and I really like that idea of integrating whiteboard with the kind of video integration in interaction.
Mm-hmm.
I think it works better than face to face sometimes, because a lot of times you're kind of doing stuff face to face and you're putting post-it notes up and you're kind of designing and writing on a flip chart, and then you have to like transcribe that and do something with it. If you're doing it all digitally, you're already doing all that, so you already have all the work done.
Yep.
And it also equalizes everybody, right? Like everybody has a chance to input things at the same time rather than like one person with a pen. And sometimes that one person with a pen is a bit of a bully and kind of goes like, no, that's not a good idea. I'm going to not write that down or whatever. So, facilitation is quite different for virtual events. So I think that's interesting.
No, I agree on that. I'm sorry, guy.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you were saying, you said you'll come back to the metaverse. I would like to complete your thoughts.
I will. So metaverse. I'm not a fan. I have to admit, I would say I'm not a fan. I think it's interesting from a technology perspective, and I know that the technology is moving very fast. It's getting better, but I just don't see, people walking around with VR sets on their heads, having business meetings. I don't see the advantage of that. I do see an advantage in, I don't know if you saw, there was a Google product that they kind of prototyped, which was this screen that had a camera sort of in the middle of it, and it made it much better for you to have eye contact. I think things like that are actually way more important than having a 3D VR headset, because if I can, like at the moment, I'm looking at a camera that I have set up, there's lights around, and then you're over here. So if I'm looking at you, you can't tell that I'm looking at you, and then that doesn't really look very good on camera. We can solve that. That small detail is going to make a huge difference, because I don't like looking at a camera. I'd like to look at you and kind of have more of that connection. So anything that we can do there will be, I think, in my mind, more important than the metaverse. And I think there's a lot of things that Web3 and those kind of like big concepts that people are throwing around tries to solve that isn't a problem worth solving. I think there's a lot of things that are more important to solve than kind of 3D-fying everything.
Okay, I'll just give my quick nuggets on the three things that you mentioned. See, I totally agree with you on the mural board part. Again, we have seen in many cases where the virtual element of mural board integration or some of the other things that our customers have been using just has a lot more ROI than doing the same thing in person. For example, a recruitment event, we see that people are waiting in line for hours just to talk to a recruiter, when the same recruitment event happens online. That has far better efficiency than happening in person and so forth. And there are many of those cases. For the spatial one, I also agree. The clients have been loving the spatial connectivity part, and similar to how you do it in an actual event, where you never bring in 10,000 people into a small room. Just because a virtual room, theoretically speaking, can allow it, does not mean that you should do it, right? It should be actually like you would typically do it in a physical setting, right? Have 30, 50, 70, 80 people in a room, depending on how much you have virtual real estate over there. Just because an icon can be on top of an icon, can be on top of an icon, you shouldn't do that, because it eventually will kind of won't give you the benefit that you want to get from a spatial networking. And last but not least, even though we are building stuff for Metaverse, I also totally agree with you. Metaverse is not at all, for most of the B2B events out there, the ROI is just not there. It looks cool, but in the end, you're not there for a cool factor. You're there for to see the engagement, to see people actually have interacted with the content, with the people, and most of the audience just out there is just not ready for that, right? So I'm in total agreement with all three. And honestly speaking, I'm telling you purely from first-hand experience of hundreds of customers actually using all of those features. Some of them they signed up because they looked cool, but just didn't see the engagement further forward. And the others, they actually benefit a lot more in a virtual setting than in an in-person setting.
You kind of covered one of my favorite kind of sayings or things, which is just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Like just because technically virtual events are almost unlimited doesn't mean that works. And I do appreciate when companies kind of build that thinking into their design and their UX, right? Because sometimes you have this thing like, oh, why is there a limit of 30 people on your breakouts? And it's like, well, because more than 30 really doesn't work for breakouts. So although technically we could have 1,000, you really shouldn't. And I think some planners are a bit offended because it's like, well, I'll decide whatever I want to do. But I do think that it's important for software and for tools to just, almost have a personality and be like, this is what we've designed this for, and to make it work the best way, this is the how it works.
Sure. We're just around the kind of time. So let's just jump into the in-person events. Miguel, just your perspective, do you think in-person events nowadays are much more harder to organize post-pandemic? What's your take on in-person events and just how people should go about their budgets to provide bigger and better event experience in order to get people there?
It's a very tough question to answer. I think that the big thing is uncertainty, right? I think we've been doing some research on attendance, and we were looking at a lot of the kind of major events, and they seem to be sort of stuck at about 2/3 of the audience that they had in 2019. And that number seems to kind of come up on and on, over and over and over. And I think a lot of people are doing in-person events exactly the same way as they used to do them. And that's going to wear out pretty quickly. I think we went through this period where people are just really happy to be back meeting in person, and a little bit of a backlash against technology and virtual events. And it's a bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. You kind of move on. And I think the dust's going to settle pretty quickly. Unfortunately, there's still people that are immunocompromised. There's accessibility issues where in-person doesn't work. And I'm not sure in-person events are going to get back to where they were, and maybe they shouldn't. So I like to think more about how do we develop, how do we progress, rather than how do we go back to where we were. So I think there are examples, like we tracked some examples of events that are doing really well, like Collision in Toronto is, massive event. They kind of broke the 2019 record by quite a margin. I think part of that is the topic. It's a very technology driven event. So technology is still a very hot industry, even if there is a recession. So, part of that, but there is, there's an excitement around those events. There's something works, people get excited about attending those events. And I think we need to be able to do that, no matter how boring the topic of the event or the topic of the association might be, to outsiders. There needs to be a bit of like a consumer marketing element to how events are put together. And I think that applies, across the board. So the more we can get people excited and really make the most of being there, because it feels like extra hard work to travel to an event at the moment. So you really want to make sure people feel like, it was really worth me, fighting through the airport and figuring all this stuff out. So I'm excited. I just feel like we kind of had the pent up demand for in-person events, and everybody kind of was really happy, particularly on the supplier side, really happy to have events to go to again. I think the dust's going to settle pretty quickly, and I think 23 is going to be this year of like, we have to try some new stuff here, or else that's not going to work anymore. So I'm really interested to see how that develops.
Yeah, Miguel, I like what you said. Just because pandemic is almost over, up until I heard from Candace in the morning about monkeypox news, happening all over North America one more time. But let's assume that it's over. But yeah, it doesn't mean that we have to go back where we were before. Just because, again, if we have learned better things throughout this pandemic, the idea is just to see what works best for the audience. It might be in person, it might be virtual, it might be hybrid. And I agree with you. See, a lot of in-person events that even we support, the best of the best ones out there are getting that 2/3 traffic, and except for kind of a one or two use cases in there, like collision. But these are about the best of the best. Most of the others actually not even getting 2/3 traffic. Especially the ones that had a lot of international audience, or even just statewide audience in North America. So, and again, this is after, as you said, after a lot of excitement to go back in person. When people are trying in person, they're comparing those numbers with the numbers that they were having virtually, and then they're having just pre-pandemic, and they are already thinking that, do I have to do just in person for the sake of it, just because I have to do it, or this is where I want to go back? Or when I look at the numbers, what works best? Because now everyone's audience is becoming different. A lot of company employees are working from home. They're no longer in the office. They no longer are travel friendly. Their lifestyle have changed with the way they are, kind of upbringing their families and so forth. So yeah, I think things will become just a lot more clear in 2023. In between, there's just a lot of excitement and a lot of experiment just with different things going on.
Exciting times ahead, but different times, definitely. We're gonna relearn a lot of things.
I agree. So I want to give our audience a chance to ask any questions that they may have for you. Again, I see that there were a lot of commentary going on in the chat area, very engaging audience. So let me see if there are any questions out there for Miguel. And guys, if you have any questions, I'll skim through it right now, but if you want to repost it on chat so that they're there, I can just quickly pick it up.
Yep, open to any questions, any thoughts. I'd love to hear if you disagree as well, because I think it's nice, to agree with everything. But it's great if you have a different opinion, and we can always comment on that.
So just one question. See, again, some of the people are looking at some of the best trends in the event industry. You did mention about the whiteboard collaboration. You also mentioned your take on Metaverse. Just, do you want to pick up like one or two just trends that you're seeing either on virtual or hybrid or in person that you want just this audience to experiment with?
Sure, and feel free to prompt in any kind of direction. I didn't prepare any trends in particular, but I think one trend that I am seeing is the word hybrid disappearing. I see a lot of event tech providers not talking about hybrid anymore, and also events. It tends to be now an in-person event plus virtual. It tends to be like an in-person and a virtual experience. And I think that makes sense. I think we thought this word hybrid was going to be really good and really kind of helpful. But I think for an audience that isn't involved in organizing events, hybrid is confusing. Like, what does that mean? Like, what do I do? So I think it's really important to kind of separate those things. And then, like you mentioned earlier, create a really valuable experience, right? And that valuable experience maybe just have really good on-demand content, right? Like, that's okay too, but I think it's a choice. If you want to deliver something live where you have people's attention live, then you need to give them a reason to be there live. Like, I think Q&A is super simple but super important. If there's extra value in being able to be part of a Q&A because you're there live or virtually live, that's a reason to attend live. But I also think if you're going to then just kind of focus more on creating really good on-demand content, like creating a nice library of content, you need to invest in editing. There's a lot of work to make a live session work afterwards on demand. If you think of TED Talks, like classic example, millions or billions of views, they're very TV friendly, right? The format itself is 18 minutes. It's very kind of from the stage communication, it just works. You record it, multiple angles, you make a good production out of it, and you post it. They still process it and do a lot of things with it, but essentially it's done, right? Not all live content works like that. I think, for example, interviews and panel discussions are hard. Like they don't really translate very well as content. So, if you record a panel that has some really great takes and some really good information, it may be better to chop that up afterwards in editing and make kind of like a top tips kind of, summary video or something out of it that's not a panel discussion, because I don't see a lot of people, and this is very generic, but I don't see a lot of people consuming a panel discussion on demand. That's a hard thing to kind of watch later. So I think that's very important. And I think collaborations with video editors and people that really do that well, I think are going to be really important going forward, particularly for associations and academic bodies that really want to have like a nice body of work based on what was done at the event.
Jemima has a couple of questions. I will just ask you one quick one. What's your recommendation for length of sessions in a hybrid event? And I'm assuming that what she meant is that you have in-person event where people are seeing that, but that's also broadcasted to this virtual audience. Again, we do that a lot with a lot of our customers. But again, we know that when you're sitting there in person, you might have a very different just appetite for how long can you sit there versus the virtual audience, just to kind of keep them engaged. Just what's your take on that, that magic number that works for both?
I think that kind of like 20 to 30 minute is probably where the sweet spot is. And I think if we're honest, 3-hour sessions in a dark room were never good to start off with, right? I don't think that our brain really is made to concentrate for that long. So I think it's more about really learning from our behaviors as people and kind of matching that up. So I think like a 20-minute session is long enough to kind of explore a topic, but not too long. So if you're not interested, you're going to like leave or whatever. So I think that's a good level. Panels and things with more people can be a little bit longer, but I think 20 minutes is good. I think the one thing to really watch out for is changeovers and kind of connecting the dots. Because while the kind of on-stage content may work very well for the virtual audience and for the people on stage, those awkward bits in between a lot of times don't work very well for the virtual audience. So there's a big need, in my mind. I think it really works if you have a separate presenter or something else programmed for the virtual audience while the people are changing on the stage and that kind of thing. And if it's a really big production and the stage changes are really fast, that might work okay. But I would still consider, kind of adding some like pre-recorded content or some other stuff to keep the online audience engaged while these things are happening on the stage, because it's just a very different experience when you're live. If you think about a live TV show or like, anything like that, there's always the halftime show, there's always the interviews, there's always something else happening. So if you think about it more like that kind of production, that makes sense. But I think the length of the sessions, probably there. It's like a quarter, I guess, of a basketball game or a hockey game or whatever it is. It's sort of like around the same time.
I agree with, I think, both you and Richard. Richard also mentioned, like, I think just in that, but like for me also 30 minutes is just the key. And again, what we have seen, just because we run a lot of these events with thousands of sessions, we have seen that the drop off rate increases the moment you hit that 31st minute, right? So the very first 30 minutes, you have the audience that came at the start of the webinar. Up until 30 minutes, you will see a good 95% plus attendance focus ratio. But the moment you hit that 31st minute, you see the impact of that just going down. That's what at least our stats tell. Just a few more questions. I know that we're already 10 minutes above. Jemima, you have questions about again, what system would you recommend? Of course, we here at vFairs would recommend vFairs, but for us, we again, happy to point you in the right direction. And I agree, Jemima, with you. Cost is an implication for any hybrid event, and I think the idea for you is to find out what works best for you. Again, you can reach out to Miguel. Miguel, how people can connect with you socially or by email. So at least we'll email them about that as well as remember, if you want to get in touch with us, we would also love to kind of help you
Sure,
out.
happy to share my email. I can put it in the chat if you want, or connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the best place. I do spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, so that's a good place. I would, if you don't mind, I'll jump in and ask and make a suggestion in terms of the
Go ahead.
how to select a platform. That's something I've kind of dug into a lot, and I don't like to talk about specific platforms, but what I would suggest is before you look at the platform, that's me on LinkedIn in the chat, before you look at specific platforms, think about the concept of your event first, then think about the processes and the people you're going to involve in getting to that event. So who are the speakers? How are they going to be managed? How is that content going to be delivered? And then think about the platform. Because I think if you start with the platform, then that really dictates what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And I think it's really good to kind of keep the platform last. It's good. It's important to know what the potential of the platforms are. So like, what are the features that are available? But then I would sort of switch off a little bit and kind of like, okay, let me figure out the concept. And then let me go back and figure out, okay, of these platforms that I think might work, which one would suit it better? And more often than not, there isn't a perfect solution. It's always going to be a compromise. And one thing, and I don't know vFairs in depth, but one thing that I think is also worth considering is sometimes using more than one platform. It might be that this one feature works really well in this one thing, and then another feature works well there. As long as they can be integrated, as long as there's like plugins and APIs that can connect things, then it's worth considering using more than one. Sometimes, if it adds a lot of complication, then no, but just keep that as an option and keep an open mind around that.
Yeah. And just I think just to add on what Miguel said, the way we think about events is, we are in a technology industry, and it's a technology that should help solve that problem. But the way we have always treated events is also like a hospitality industry. You would need a lot of assistance, guidance, help, kind of consulting from the people who have been doing these events for over a decade, or who are seeing how events are being run now by hundreds of other customers. So I just feel that just looking at again, any vendor's customer support, look us or look anyone on G2, what thousands of other customers have to say about how quick or adaptive their technology is, or how quick or adaptive their customer support is something for you guys to just also look into once you have a fair idea of how you want to run your event. Miguel, thank you so much. Everyone, please be sure to follow Miguel on social media for a lot of insightful information and news on events. And if you want to learn about anything about vFairs or about any of the in-person, virtual, or hybrid events, you can reach out to vFairs also at sales@vfairs.com if you have any questions around any of the things. As a reminder, you all will receive a follow-up email from us that will include the on-demand link for this webcast. Miguel, once again, thank you so much for your time today. I know your time is extremely valuable, so thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jonas. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody watching. You have my email and you have my LinkedIn, so do connect and send over any questions, anything I can help with.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.